Welcome to the Solid Verbal. And now, Dan and Ty.
Dan Rubenstein, we have breaking news.
We do. I was actually thinking about drinking as soon as you mentioned what the news was, that Billy Napier has been fired by the University of Florida, and doing a spit take. What?
Yeah.
I thought you just missed me. We're doing this stream. No. Boop, 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 boop. And Florida has moved on from Billy Napier in the middle of his fourth season, I believe.
Middle of his fourth season. We can get to that. We can get to some candidates that I saw come across the wire. The news of the day is quite simply Billy Napier has been fired, as you said, in the middle of his fourth season at Florida. If reports on social media are to be believed, there could be others today. Have not heard those yet. Don't know if that will happen or not. But As we have said time and again, yes, this is going to be a rather active coaching carousel. Billy Napier, the news of him being fired should come as no great surprise to anybody, Dan Rubenstein. This has sort of been in the works for 2 years, I would say, at a minimum. Constantly, there are expectations at Florida. Billy Napier came over from Louisiana. It was, at the time, seemingly one of those moves that felt like a bit of a no-brainer. But alas, here we are, 22-23, his final record at Florida. A lot to unpack here, but again, no great surprise. It just seems as if it's going to be a continuing cycle now as we enter into silly season, latter part of October, early part of November.
Yeah, so always a little bit of a surprise, I guess, when it comes after a win. Usually there's sort of a game that's the last straw. I can't believe this program lost to Northwestern or whatever in the case of Penn State. But they did beat Mississippi State. It wasn't the most beautiful, elegant offensive performance the Florida Gators have ever put forth on a football field. But all the same, they have a bye week and then the Georgia game. And so in terms of timing, this is, I suppose, as ideal to figure out new rhythms under an interim coach ahead of a monstrous rivalry matchup in Jacksonville. But if the confidence didn't exist that this Florida team was going to be able to dramatically get better this season and the years beyond, both on the field, on the recruiting trail, in the transfer portal, then you make the move, right? If you feel like this is in the best interest of future success possibilities for Florida and what the SEC landscape looks like moving forward, then there's no time like the present, I guess. It's hard to look at Billy Napier's time in Gainesville and come away impressed with a lot. There have been superb players. There have been surprising performances. There have been great individual games for players. There have been promising prospects playing various positions. You know, the current, duo right now on offense of DJ Lagway and Dallas Wilson headlined that. But he has had promising, high-level, all-conference caliber, all-American caliber players in years past, and they haven't been able to translate that into big, consistent wins. So I definitely understand where Florida fans are coming from, given that they have, in the modern era, won plural national championships, have an expectation of high-level recruiting in the state of Florida and in the portal, that there seems to be financial backing to traverse the transfer portal effectively. Did I use traverse correctly?
I think so. Yeah.
Yes. That I think there is a legitimate high bar in place, and Billy Napier failed to meet it. But also, now post Urban Meyer, we have coach after coach after coach. If you want to look at Will Muschamp, if you want to look at Dan Mullen, if you want to look at now Billy Napier, if you want to look at Jim McElwain, that people keep coming up short of these sort of nebulous expectations. Is it win national championships? Is it win 10, 11 games? The SEC is obviously more difficult now than it was in the Urban Meyer era, and you're no longer operating in a time where there is an easier path in the SEC East because there is no SEC East. So you're dealing with a deeper conference. They're now going to go to 9 conference games. You have a very difficult non-conference opponent sometimes in Florida State, sometimes. That's an annual matchup. And so the Florida job is very difficult. but has a high ceiling. And we now have, again, this is what, 4 post-Urban Meyer, unless I'm forgetting somebody, 4 post-Urban Meyer coaches who have not really been able to consistently meet that expectation.
So just to give you the rundown on Billy Napier,
Yeah.
again, off to a 3-4 start this season, very underwhelming. 22-23 overall. The buyout figure is interesting, if only because, given recent events, particularly at Penn State and otherwise, we've had conversations about guys like Mike Norvell. $21.2 million is a lot of cabbage. It's not nearly as much cabbage as some of the other jobs around college football. Certainly a far cry from what Kurt Signetti just signed at Indiana, which is something to the tune of $93 million. But 21.2, Florida is going to eat that in order to get rid of Napier. The other thing that I would add, just sort of on the heels of you unpacking the situation at Florida, there has definitely been some consternation with respect to the Florida offense.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel like much of the angst surrounding Napier in Gainesville has crystallized with what we see on offense. Billy Napier was almost insistent upon calling plays. They didn't bring in an outside offensive coordinator to try and retool things. Instead, they went out, they got a bunch of great talent, DJ Lagway, you mentioned Dallas Clark, among some others.
Yes.
So there was excitement, building excitement about what this team could be on offense coming into the season. And alas, I don't know if it's the insistence on him calling the plays. I don't know if it is a deeper structural situation about not being able to maximize that talent, but Florida is a place that through the years we have associated with having dynamic offense. And for whatever reason, though we have seen it in flashes over the Napier era, and certainly more recently now with DJ Lagway at the helm, it just never got there consistently. And I think that among many other things, right? For a while, it was the defense. They kind of fixed the defense, at least got it to a point where it's much more serviceable and not a liability.
And
but
improved
on offense,
this year, by the way. Not by a huge margin, but did improve this year so far.
Absolutely. So the offense, though, is the thing. Yeah. That, to me, is the thing that I think Florida fans, I know people who have written into us, have pointed to time and again about Napier's insistence on calling the plays. What could they be if they had a better play caller in there? I guess now we will find out. Now we will find out. I do have a list of candidates per our friend Andy Staples over at On3, but I just wanted to remind people who are watching this live, if you have any comments, if you have any questions, you have anything you'd like to say as part of the live stream here, the emergency live stream, send those in. You got to be a subscriber, so hit subscribe. If you're watching on YouTube, we will do our best to make sure that most of the fine comments are accounted for. We can't accommodate all of them.
Right.
So an interesting list of candidates now, per our friend Andy Staples over at On3.
Yeah, which, by the way, just to respond, and you can leave this list up on the screen if you're watching the live stream. It was, I think, the 2020 season in which they produced a top 10 offense. It wasn't that long ago. The Dan Mullen, experiment ultimately failed and was not going to keep going in an upward trajectory. But the Kyle Trask, I think it was Kadarius Toney, Trevon Grimes, Kyle Pitts, it was a spectacularly successful offense. And so we're not talking about 2008, 2006, and, all the speed they had way back when as the potential. The potential was an hour and a half ago, basically. And so you understand why Florida fans are sort of despondent after watching this team during the Billy Napier era. Continue.
I absolutely do. 100%. So here is the list that Andy put out.
Okay.
Over on 3. Some of these are more realistic than others. I did have an opportunity to watch the stream that he and Ari did.
Okay.
Which, of course, encourage people to go and watch Andy and Ari, two of our best friends in the business.
Disagree. Solid verbal only. Continue.
Andy is, of course, a Florida alum, so he had some
lives in Gainesville.
Harsh thoughts on this. Lane Kiffin is the guy. Andy says that he doesn't know if Lane would take the job, but Lane Kiffin's going to be the first target.
Okay.
And that makes a lot of sense. The second one on this list is Marcus Freeman. You're going to see Marcus Freeman on every list. I don't honestly believe he's going to leave Notre Dame, but as I said, with respect to the Penn State opening, you'd be crazy to not at least call and find out, hey, are you happy there?
By the way, with regard to everybody on this list, and I think you're correct, I think when you have a very successful coach in his 30s, which I believe Marcus Freeman still is, right? You look at the world as being full of potential and what could he do in a place, and again, this applies to everybody on this list that you're about to go through, in a place that's closer to major recruits, that plays in what many consider to be, probably myself included, the deepest conference in terms of huge name college football brands. And you think to yourself, okay, if this guy had even more
Right.
nearby, what could he do? What kind of recruiter could Marcus Freeman be if he were just staying in state and have the ability nationally to sell an enormous brand like the Florida Gators? Continue.
And I think for sure that was something that had more sway 5 years ago. But as we have seen a couple
Agree.
times over now, it doesn't mean as much as it used to. It still is beneficial. But with what's going on in the portal, your ability to just be a hard and fast recruiter and have some resources behind you that can help you build a roster or at least help you bring in talent quickly, that is paramount. But proximity to talent should not be overlooked. Proximity to talent in Florida is definitely a thing. As many have said with Freeman, you'd be crazy to at least not call and ask.
Right.
Eli Drinkwitz is another name. You and I mentioned him on one of the bonus episodes that we did at verballers.com on Thursday. But Drink is an interesting name. He has done a really good job recruiting at Mizzou. He has put out really good offenses at Mizzou. I'm not sure if he'd be willing to leave Mizzou. But alas, you got to throw him in here as well. Jeff Brom is another one. This is the first time I have seen Jeff Brom on any of these lists. Again, it's not my list. This is Andy's. But Jeff Brom's an interesting name. After beating Miami on the road, and I think continuing his track record for being a bit of a giant killer, and if nothing more, going into these games against teams perceived to be top 10, top 15, Jeff Brom doesn't get out coached in these games, Dan. Jeff Brom goes in with a pretty good track record for game planning, at least putting his team in a position to win.
Right.
So
Okay.
Jeff Brom's an interesting name here. Jed Fish, look, Andy included Jed Fish. I've been talking about Jed Fish to Florida now for 3 years.
Went to Florida, idolizes Steve Spurrier, and is somebody who has improved terrible situations like he did at Arizona, and obviously has Washington at least decent after having their head coach completely abandon the program after a national championship experience, and did a number on that roster that Jed Fish immediately had to patch up in a number of places. Continue.
I am not going to do the thing where I try to speak Jed Fish to Florida into existence.
Right.
I'm just saying, I understand why there is an obvious tie-in here, and nobody should be surprised if you hear a lot about Jed Fish with respect to this opening. Okay, that's all.
Yep.
We'll leave it there.
Sure.
Brent Key and Fran Brown are two other names, interesting names. Brent Key, to me, seems like a guy who lives and eats all things Georgia Tech.
Right.
He's a very proud Georgia Tech alum. He definitely has built a culture at Georgia Tech that is tough and presumably in the driver's seat now for the ACC title game, if not more.
Right.
Is that a guy that would consider leaving to get better resources, more of a football focus at Florida? I don't know. But Brent Key, I think, is a name that should come up.
Is it
with
Georgia
other
Tech
openings.
alum? Is an alum.
Is an alum.
And so there is a personal tie to Georgia Tech that can't be understated, and has SEC experience, right? He was at Alabama with Nick Saban. A lot of these guys, obviously, with Eli Drinkwitz coaching in the SEC, Lane Kiffin coaching in the SEC, Lane Kiffin coaching in the state of Florida, and has a number of those connections in the state for recruiting purposes. Fran Brown, you're going to mention in a second. Obviously, the Georgia experience with him is not nothing. So there is connective tissue to the conference as well. But yeah, Brent Key does have that personal tie with Georgia Tech. Continue.
Yeah, and the final name, as you said, is Fran Brown. Fran Brown, currently of Syracuse, as you know. Fran Brown, I think, in short order up at Syracuse, has done a really good job. If nothing more, has proven that he can come in quickly. He can get talent in there. He can put an offense out on the field. I think Fran Brown is a very, very gifted recruiter. And it wouldn't surprise me if we see his name come up with other openings that are sure to occur around college football. I think if you give him more resources, if you put him in a position where the brand sort of helps recruit,
Right.
a way that maybe it doesn't at Syracuse, that could unlock his full potential as a coach. But an interesting name. I'd be curious to hear among Florida people who are listening, who are watching to this, who it is that you think you'd be interested in getting signing on as the next head football coach. One name that I did not see on there is James Franklin. I suspect James Franklin's name is going to be on a bunch of lists,
Definitely.
if only because he has been very successful in 12 years up at Penn State, albeit maybe some difficulty winning the proverbial big one. But James Franklin is going to have his pick of the litter. I would expect that we'll see his name come up in accordance with a bunch of these.
I think that's right. And I think he has the opportunity to also take a year in the media world and let his stock increase just by staying in neutral, right? That he didn't coach this season and that he allowed himself as a name to be talked up for a year, for 6 months or whatever, and let the momentum help him there. Because right now, the last we saw of James Franklin is losing to Northwestern, UCLA, and a close one to Oregon at home in a must-win situation. But yeah, all of these names are interesting. And, Fran Brown, I think you'd like to see a little bit more of the upside. They're currently in like a 3-touchdown losing streak after losing Steve Angeli, their starting quarterback. So I think in terms of him as a name, you'd like to see a little bit more like, how does he respond to this next season, late this year? Do they improve, right? What is the Fran Brown experience when his team has been punched in the face injury wise, and how does he get this team on track? That's going to be really fun to watch. Yeah, all of these names are super interesting. For a lot of jobs, I would say, if somebody has something good at blank, why would you leave? And there are a few jobs, not a lot of jobs, where you can talk yourself into the upside somewhere else being so much like more intriguing, so much different than it is where you are because of Florida's location. Now, the downside is Florida is competing now nationally with in-state recruits. Everybody recruits Florida. You take your pick of schools, Midwest, East Coast, and you ask their fan base to name their best players the past 10, 15 years, there's a pretty great chance one of those guys or many of those guys are from the state of Florida. And so that to me is interesting. I mean, arguably the current best player in college football is from Florida and not playing in Florida, in Jeremiah Smith. So Florida is competing in a different landscape recruiting-wise, but still, there is something about the pull of playing close to home for a lot of these kids. And look, the Florida high school coaching isn't as good as it used to be. Florida high school football, reportedly, we talked to Manny Navarro about this, not as strong. Coaches are leaving for other states as it used to be. But when you look at recruiting to Mizzou, recruiting to Oxford, Mississippi, recruiting to South Bend, Indiana, recruiting to Louisville, whatever, you're recruiting kids whose parents grew up as Florida fans, or whose parents went to Florida, or whose aunt played volleyball at Florida. There's a certain local pull, and it's obviously true everywhere, but in terms of sheer numbers, you can understand why a coach would say to themselves, man, if I could build something interesting at Florida, we're talking about huge, huge results in a way that you just can't replicate at Mizzou or at Ole Miss, because obviously we've seen Florida's ceiling. So it'll take the right guy, but I think there is something potentially really interesting and magnetic about coaching in Gainesville. And you also have the negatives, right? That the expectations are crazy without recent results, all the things that AL schools like Penn State, take your pick, that you'll get paid either way, but there is something about the place that is just unrealistic if you've got it good somewhere else.
Yeah, I mean, to that point, it is a fair question now as we start to see more of these openings. And it's one that I was going to ask if I didn't see it come through, but is Florida a better job than Penn State? We're going to get to a point now pretty soon as we start to see more openings up on the board where the articles will be written, the tweets will be sent, the videos will be made comparing one job to another. Is Florida a better job than Penn State? My argument will be yeah, right now. I think it is. Proximity to talent maybe isn't as meaningful as it used to be, but is still a very significant part of what you need to do as a college football coach. I do think that a place like Florida, given the fact that you're in the SEC,
Yeah.
given the fact that you will also have every resource available to you, no question.
Yeah.
I think it's a very intriguing job. I think it's Florida by a nose. I don't think it's a clear cut.
Penn State's a weird comparison, though. Penn State's a weird comparison because they had a guy for like 70 years. So, like, the sample size of what a place could or couldn't be doesn't exist with Penn State. Penn State has had Joe Paterno, Bill O'Brien for like 17 minutes, who I think is looked at favorably given what he had to do and what, the situation was in State College when he arrived. And James Franklin, who by and large was really, really, really good, but not great. And so that's the entire track record of Penn
Right.
State. Whereas we have other coaches working out famously like Steve Spurrier and Urban Meyer, and not so much with regard to like Jim McElwain or Ron Zuck.
Yeah, I would give Florida the top spot, at least as of now, by a nose.
Yep.
But certainly those are the top two, in my opinion, that are still on the board. I do think there's a prestige factor that comes along with that Florida job that probably gives it top billing at this stage, in addition to proximity to talent and whatnot. I think the other questions that were going to start to come in, is Florida a better job than LSU, right? So given the state of affairs right now,
Yeah.
in the South and the Southeast, you have a number of positions that are either being talked about as potentially being open or assumed that they will be open at some point.
Yeah.
As we record this right now, middle of the afternoon on Sunday, October the 19th, apparently active discussions about Mike Norvell. There seems to be much angst over the tenure of Brian Kelly. I don't know if there will be a move there. There's a whole grouping of jobs just sort of generally in the area that I think could be of interest and potentially could come open. And so we're going to start to see questions like this. Is Florida better than LSU? Is it? I don't know how to answer these because that one's not open yet.
Right.
But alas, right now, Florida, I think if you're asking me which is the top job available, it's probably the Gators.
I think so. I think it's because of the local pull and because the Florida helmet is more recognizable in Tacoma, Washington, in Oakland, California, in Detroit, Michigan, in Topeka, Kansas than anything that's available right now. And the number of enormous players who have come out of Florida, the visibility of the university, of the swamp, of the orange and blue, it's just a bigger deal than what's out there. I don't know what kind of pull that has with people who are going to be pursued by Florida, but in terms of its place in the sport and what the perceived ceiling is much more difficult now. It is just a plain fact that you have to be able to sell yourself and the potential coaching staff and recruits and portal players that there is just so much more that can be accomplished hypothetically in the modern era in Gainesville than what can be accomplished at State College or in Blacksburg or if, Oxford, Mississippi, Seattle, Washington, whatever, that you do have to talk yourself into it because at Florida, you're going through Georgia and Bama and LSU and Texas and Oklahoma and South Carolina and Tennessee and, take your pick, right? That every season you're going to go 8-4, 9-3, even if you're a great team. And so there is a certain amount of, what's the word I'm looking for here, Ty? Like willful, irrational confidence in yourself and your ability to build something crazy. So I think it's a hell of a job, but the hurdles are legitimate to me.
All right, I'm going to go 2, maybe 3 more questions, and then we'll let the fine people go. All right.
Okay.
I'm curious to get your take on this one from John, who says, in terms of Kiffin, what's the biggest difference between his accomplishments and James Franklin?
What does this have to do with the Florida job?
Well, I think the tie-in with the Florida job is the fact that James Franklin is also out there, and James Franklin wasn't on this list.
Yeah.
Right. He will be on many lists, but I understand where the question is coming from because, Kiffin has bounced around. Kiffin has been at a bunch of places. I think Kiffin obviously has done a really good job at Ole Miss. He has developed pro talent. I think Lane Kiffin has done a really good job getting more, at least out of the offense, than we saw James Franklin get out of his offense up at Penn State. And I think Florida is a place that associates itself with having a dynamic offense.
Yep.
So on one hand, you've got a program builder who's very good at building a program, seemingly from the ground up in James Franklin. And on the other, I think you've got a guy like Lane Kiffin who's really good at a minimum, bringing in talent and getting the most out of his offensive weapons. Case in point, Trey Wallace. Trey Wallace, the wide receiver who comes down to Ole Miss. He's in Oxford now, came down, transferred after last season from State College, is having a pretty good year out wide. We didn't see this version of Trey Wallace at all in that Penn State offense. And so I think there's a question of who can organize those troops better on that side of the ball. And for me, that answer is far and away Lane Kiffin. So at a minimum, offensive accomplishments at a place like Florida that I think, again, associates itself, identifies with having that offense.
Yep.
To me, the answer there is Lane Kiffin.
Sure. I mean, Lane Kiffin has beaten excellent SEC teams. Lane Kiffin has beaten LSU, has beaten Georgia.
Sure.
Whereas James Franklin, it's been a minute, and the highlight of that specific win, I think, was a blocked field goal that sealed things for Penn State. That it wasn't a dominant win or anything like that. Whereas Lane Kiffin's performances have been better in typically with a more difficult schedule. Although, we can quibble about that, I guess, but it seems like the Big Ten has been more top heavy than deep during James Franklin's time there. And Lane Kiffin has just been in charge of a team with a more exciting offense in a more challenging spot traditionally in Ole Miss than what James Franklin has accomplished and dealt with.
This one from Seth, I think, is going to be the question of this coaching cycle.
Right.
For some really big places. And this is something that Penn State fans are maybe starting to come to grips with, and it probably will be a question at a place like Florida and others around college football. This is the question of hiring a accomplished head football coach versus an up-and-comer on the coordinator side.
Right.
He brings up Will Stein. Will Stein's an interesting name. Glenn Schumann, another interesting name. At Georgia, Brian Hartline, a name that seems to be getting some play right now.
Yeah.
Offensive coordinator at Ohio State. I think if you're Florida, you can shoot as high as you want right now. And I think given the fact that is probably the most marquee job available at present, it will behoove you to go after the big names.
Mm-hmm.
I don't think Florida needs to go coordinator. I think there will ultimately be a sitting head coach that will be interested enough to take that job.
But there will be both, right?
Well, coordinators certainly would want to go to Florida. I don't think there's any question about that. But the question is,
yes,
does Florida feel like it is downgrading itself in any capacity, just in terms of like credibility?
Yeah.
If they decide to go high-profile coordinator over a high-profile sitting coach.
No, see, I don't think you mean to do this, but I kind of felt like the vibe, the subtext of what you were saying is like, why would you hire a coordinator when you could hire somebody with head coaching experience? But that's not always necessarily a great thing to hire a sitting head coach, because of the transition is just different. You come in with fresher eyes as a coordinator in some cases than as you do as a head coach. This worked when I was a head coach here, so it'll work as a head coach when I'm at Florida. I think Florida would be very smart to hire or to interview 1,000 people. And one of the big things is it's not just an experience thing. It's a personality feel, because as soon as you take the Florida job, you are attending recruit practices and sitting in the living room of recruits' families. And you are doing so before and after Kirby Smart and Mario Cristobal and Dan Lanning and Ryan Day and Steve Sarkisian, right? And so that has to be somebody who can at least give off the vibe that they belong in that company, because Florida as a school is in that company. And so, yes, you could hire Eli Drinkwitz, you could hire Marcus Freeman, you could hire a lot of people who do fit in with that grouping of coaches. But also, you could hire a coordinator who has that strength of personality. You can hire that coordinator who comes in with the sort of confidence and fresh outlook that makes you stand out if you're Florida. So I wouldn't limit yourself if you're Florida, because it's not about finding the guy who has the most impressive name. It's about finding the guy who is the best clear fit to coach Florida for the next 7 to 9 years.
The news of the day, at least for now, is that Billy Napier is out at the University of Florida. Certainly much more to come on this coaching search as the carousel continues to spin. We got another one up on the board, Dan. It's still early afternoon. Who knows if there will be more by the time this day is through, by the time this weekend is through. We'll do our best, of course, to keep you fully plugged into everything going on here at the Solid Verbal. Hit follow, hit subscribe so that you don't miss any of those videos, any of our episodes. Head on out, as always, to verballers.com if you want to further support what Dan and I do. In the meantime, until more news breaks, or until our next episode, whichever comes first, I'm Ty, he's Dan. As always, stay solid.
Peace. Hire Tim Skipper.
Tim Skipper.
Hear me out. Hear me out.
Jerry Neuheisel.